Welcome to this explainer. If you've ever felt like the economic theories you hear about on the news don't quite match up with reality, well, you're definitely not alone. Today, we're going to dive into how the economy actually functions, totally bypassing the standard political talking points. We're going to explore a really fascinating framework by Roger W. Garrison. He takes aim at what he identifies as a massive, glaring blind spot in mainstream economics. So let's jump right in.
Let's start with a bit of a mystery. There's this glaring disconnect in modern economic theory that struggles to bridge what happens today with what happens tomorrow. For decades now, mainstream macroeconomics has essentially been split right down the middle. On one side, we have theories that explain short-term booms and busts, and on the completely opposite side, totally separate theories that explain long-term economic growth. But think about it, shouldn't the long run just be a seamless sequence of short runs? How can we rely on a science where these two realities never actually connect?
And this isn't just some fringe critique. Nobel laureate Robert Solow highlighted this exact fundamental problem, pointing out the lack of real coupling in our models. You see, in the short-run models, things like consumption and investment usually move together. Either everything is booming or everything is crashing. But switch over to the long-run growth models, and suddenly there's a strict trade-off. To invest more in the future, you literally have to consume less today. Mainstream theory just awkwardly jumps between these two totally contradictory realities, completely missing the long-term structural reality.
So, how do we solve this puzzle? Here is our roadmap for unpacking this economic disconnect today. First, we'll look at the missing macroeconomic link. Second, the expectations obsession. Third, a capital-based alternative. Fourth, 3 graphical building blocks. And finally, number 5, distinguishing sustainable versus unsustainable growth.
Section 1. The missing macroeconomic link.
To understand how we got here, we have to look back at the Great Depression, which is when modern macroeconomics essentially broke away from its classical roots. In the 1930s, economists like John Maynard Keynes started lumping all these complex economic activities into massive sweeping aggregates. They looked at total labor, total output, and total investment. But in doing so, they stripped out the absolutely crucial details of capital. Think of this highly aggregated Keynesian model like a wheelbarrow. Because they removed the internal balancing mechanisms of relative prices and shifting capital, the model looked inherently unstable. If you have a wheelbarrow, someone external literally needs to hold the handles to keep it upright, right? Hence the call for constant monetary and fiscal policy intervention. The classical view, on the other hand, is much more like a unicycle. Sure, it might look a little precarious to an outsider, but it has internal mechanisms, the relative movements of incomes, prices, and interest rates, that actually allow it to self-balance without external hands artificially propping it up.
Section 2. The expectations obsession. So what happens when you remove the actual structure of capital from an economic model? Well, you lose the very mechanism that anchors today's production to tomorrow's consumption. Without capital theory, the reasons behind business investments suddenly start looking like pure psychology, what Keynes famously called animal spirits. To try and patch this massive hole, later mainstream economists became totally obsessed with rational expectations. To make the math work, these so-called new classical economists created sterile models relying on a representative agent. Just imagine thousands of identical penguins standing on a flat, featureless block of ice, trading identical back-scratching services with one another. It's ridiculous, right? But they stripped away all the complex, messy differences between real businesses and real people just to isolate how perfectly rational actors might predict the future. It's a mathematically rigorous model for sure, but critics argue it was a theoretical dead end because it forgot that the economy is a time-consuming process of transforming raw materials into finished goods.
Section 3. A capital-based alternative. Okay, so if the labor-based models give us a wobbly wheelbarrow and the expectation-based models give us penguins on ice, Garrison argues we desperately need a macroeconomics that recognizes two things. Production isn't instantaneous, and capital isn't just one giant uniform blob. This brings us to Roger W. Garrison's definitive book on the subject, Time and Money. This introduces the Austrian school's approach to reconnecting the short and long run. Building on earlier foundational economists like F.A. Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, Garrison's framework doesn't just ask how much capital we have, it asks what kind and when it's actually going to yield consumer goods. By shifting our focus back to the intertemporal structure of capital, meaning how capital is deployed over time, this model attempts to finally provide that missing link we've been talking about.
Section 4. 3 graphical building blocks. Now, the crucial point is how we actually visualize this. Garrison's framework relies on 3 interlocking, very accessible graphical blocks. Step 1, we start with the market for loanable funds. Step 2, we move to the production possibilities frontier.
And step 3, we end with the intertemporal structure of production. Each of these blocks has a reputable history and economics on its own, but it's the integration of all three that creates the specific capital-based view. And don't worry, we are absolutely not going to get bogged down in complex equations here.
Let's start with loanable funds. It is vital to understand that saving here means saving up for something later. It directly fuels the investments needed for the future. You see, in standard Keynesian models, saving is often seen as a negative thing, a leakage that causes recessions because people supposedly aren't spending. But in this capital-based view, people don't just shove their money into a mattress. They save up for future consumption. Those savings become loanable funds or investable resources for the business community. And the interest rate? That is the critical price tag here. It signals to entrepreneurs exactly how much in resources consumers are willing to delay consuming today so that businesses can borrow them to build the factories and the technologies of tomorrow.
Which brings us to the second block and the hard reality of scarcity. To grow our future capacity, we literally have to make sacrifices in our current consumption. You might actually remember the production possibilities frontier from your very first economics class. It's that classic curve showing that if you want more of one thing, you have to give up some of another, the famous guns versus butter dynamic. Here, the trade-off is between consumption and investment. If an economy wants to grow, meaning it wants to push that curve outward for future years, it must move along the curve today, reducing current consumption to increase investment. There are no free lunches. Growth requires genuine saving.
And now the third block. Here is where we finally inject time into the equation, showing how raw resources are slowly transformed into consumable output across a sequence of interconnected stages. This is often visualized as a right triangle, famously known in economics as the Hayekian triangle. Think of it like this. One side of the triangle represents the final consumer goods we actually buy, but the other side tracks the time and the stages it takes to make them. Mining iron ore happens in an early stage, stamping steel parts in a middle stage, selling a finished car on a lot in a late stage. That interest rate we talked about earlier, that's the mechanism that keeps all these different stages perfectly coordinated with what consumers actually want and exactly when they want it.
Section 5. Sustainable versus unsustainable growth.
Now let's ramp up the energy and apply this complete framework to something you hear about in the news literally every single day: economic growth. Through this framework, we can clearly see the difference between a natural, healthy market process and a policy-driven illusion. According to Garrison, sustainable growth happens when consumers genuinely decide to save more. This lowers the interest rate naturally. Businesses read this signal and invest in long-term projects, those early stages of production we just talked about, knowing that the resources are actually there and the future demand will be there. Everything coordinates perfectly. But what happens if a central bank artificially lowers the interest rate by expanding credit without any genuine saving by consumers? Well, you get unsustainable growth. Businesses start long-term projects because borrowing is cheap, but consumers haven't actually freed up the resources by saving. The economy is suddenly at war with itself. The unicycle loses its balance, the wheelbarrow tips over. The result? A boom, inevitably followed by a massive bust once reality sets in.
So, I want to leave you with this provocative thought to keep in mind the very next time you hear a political promise about the economy. When leaders pledge to force growth through cheap credit, this framework asks us to consider a really important question. Are they genuinely encouraging the hard work of saving and investment, or are they just tampering with the interest rate and setting us up for another crash? By looking at the economy through the lens of time and capital, you definitely gain a whole new perspective on the promise of a quick fix. Thank you for joining me on this explainer.